The vaulted silence of the apostolic archives was a world apart from the bustling life of the Vatican above. Here, beneath layers of ancient stone, time slowed. The air itself seemed heavy, dense with the breath of centuries past. Dust floated in still beams of light that sliced through narrow windows, and every footstep echoed like a whisper among the towering shelves. Captain Elias Hartmann moved carefully through the labyrinth of manuscripts, scrolls, and locked cabinets. Newly appointed as commander of the Swiss Guard after the funeral of Pope Francis, Elias had been tasked with inspecting the security systems of the archives, a routine assignment, but one he approached with his usual quiet precision. At 38, Elias embodied the essence of the Guard, tall, disciplined, with a face carved in solemn lines and eyes that saw everything but revealed nothing. His life had been one of devotion, to duty, to silence, to the invisible code of honor that bound each guard to the church itself. And yet, today something felt different. Deep in a restricted wing, Elias paused before a cabinet marked only by a worn bronze plaque, Benedictions non publicae, private blessings. The door was ajar, almost imperceptibly, a subtle anomaly. He hesitated, instincts prickling. No one entered these sections without high-level permission. He reached out and pushed the door open with 2 fingers. A faint creak broke the heavy silence. Inside, stacked neatly on ancient oak shelves, were boxes labeled with dates and names, blessings given to private citizens, special prayers offered to dying monarchs, unseen pieces of history quietly folded into the church's memory. Elias ran his gloved fingertips lightly over the spines, respectful of their fragile age. One box caught his eye. It was newer than the others, its wood unstained by centuries, its label handwritten, not printed like the rest. Franciscus, Ultima, Benedictio, Francis, the final benediction. For a moment, Elias simply stared. The late Pope's personal blessing. Why had it been filed here, away from public ceremony? Carefully, he lifted the lid. Inside, atop a layer of protective cloth, was a single sheet of vellum. Its ink was slightly uneven, the handwriting unmistakably that of an aging man, the same hand Elias had seen once or twice in signatures during his years of service. He should have closed the box, should have walked away, but something in him, some quiet stirring of intuition, compelled him to read. The words were simple, almost stark against the creamy parchment. To those the world does not see, the lonely, the broken, the forgotten, know this: you are beloved beyond measure. In the silence of your heart, find the echo of God's first whisper. Before there were kings, before there were priests, before there were walls, you are seen. You are held. You are enough. Elias exhaled, unaware he'd been holding his breath. This wasn't a blessing meant for dignitaries or televised masses. This was something else, something raw. A final gift from a man who had understood that faith wasn't built only within marble walls, but also in the cracks between them. The captain gently replaced the vellum, sealing the box once more. But as he stood there, his heart thundered in his chest. This was meant to be shared. He felt it in his bones, deeper than logic, beyond orders. And yet, the weight of his uniform seemed to press harder against his shoulders. The centuries of discipline, the layers of invisible duty, do not speak, do not act without permission, all of it warred inside him. Elias left the cabinet as he had found it, neat, untouched, but the letter's words burned behind his eyes as he locked the door and walked back through the winding halls. That night, alone in his quarters, he sat staring at the faint reflection of his face in the small mirror above his writing desk. His own expression startled him. Not fear, not confusion, but something deeper. Conviction. Captain Hartmann realized, perhaps for the first time, that service to the church was not about guarding its stone, but about protecting its spirit, and some truths, he thought, cannot remain buried. The following days at the Vatican passed with mechanical predictability, but Captain Elias Hartman felt as if he moved through a world slightly out of phase with everyone else. Ceremonies continued. Diplomats came and went. The College of Cardinals deliberated in solemn closed sessions. The Swiss guards, ever stoic, rotated through their precise patrols and ceremonial posts, their brightly colored uniforms standing out against the ancient gray stones of the Vatican walls. But inside Elias, a war raged in silence. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the words again. "You are beloved beyond measure." He had not spoken of the hidden benediction to anyone, not even to Father Ventresca, the aging secretary who had once been close to Pope Francis and who might have understood. He had locked the memory away, just as the Church had locked the letter away. And yet it gnawed at him. Each morning when he adjusted the crimson sash across his chest or polished the silver trim of his halberd, Elias felt the growing weight of a question he had never dared ask before. Was obedience always the highest form of loyalty? He was a man built for duty, shaped by years of rigorous discipline, taught that service meant invisibility. His pride had always come from the way he disappeared into the larger grandeur of the Church, never drawing attention, never faltering. But now, that same training felt like a cage. The benediction was not a state secret. It was not a political letter. It was a final prayer for the unseen, the wounded, the very people the Church claimed to defend. And yet it had been hidden, filed away among diplomatic notes and forgotten blessings, buried where no pilgrim would ever hear its message. One evening, Elias stood alone in the barracks chapel, a small stone-walled room lit only by a single flickering candle before the crucifix. He knelt stiffly, the cold stone biting into his knees through the wool of his uniform. He prayed, but the words felt hollow. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if silence was loyalty or cowardice. In his mind, he imagined Pope Francis again, not as the towering figure that the world knew, but as the gentle old man who had once told a young Swiss guard in a quiet study, "Sometimes the holiest thing we can do is move when we're told to stand still." What would it mean to move now? Risk his career? Risk dishonor? Risk being seen not as a loyal son of the Church, but as a traitor to its traditions? Elias bowed his head lower, the candlelight blurring before his eyes. This wasn't about rebellion. He had no hunger for attention, no bitterness toward authority. It was about the soul of the Church, the invisible current that had drawn him into service as a young man, when he believed that guarding sacredness meant more than just guarding walls. The benediction belonged to the people, not hidden behind Vatican stone, not whispered in guarded rooms. It was a message written with the trembling hand of a dying man who had understood that faith lived and breathed among the broken, the forgotten, the unseen. As he rose from his knees, Elias felt a strange clarity settle over him, steady and heavy as armor. He did not need to shout. He did not need to defy openly. But he could not remain entirely silent either. In the private corridors of the Swiss guards' quarters, where no cameras lurked and only trusted brothers in arms gathered, Elias began to quietly ask simple questions. What if, he said one night over shared bread and coffee, some blessings were meant to be shared even if they were not proclaimed? Most simply nodded politely, thinking nothing of it. Some looked puzzled. But a few, those who had loved Pope Francis personally, those who had seen his compassion firsthand, held Elias's gaze and understood. By the end of that week there were a handful who knew. No grand plan. No rebellion plotted. Just a quiet agreement. To honor the true spirit of a pope who had believed that sometimes the Church's greatest acts of holiness happened not under the gilded ceilings of St. Peter's Basilica, but in the secret places where wounded souls still listened for a whisper of hope. It was a cool Friday evening when the decision, unspoken yet understood, finally took shape. The Vatican courtyards were quiet at dusk. Tourists had long since been ushered out. The grand halls and passageways echoed only with the soft footfalls of priests, nuns, and the ever-watchful Swiss guards. Captain Elias Hartman moved carefully through the side corridors, his ceremonial boots muffled against ancient stone. In his hand, folded within the sleeve of his dark coat, was a small reproduction of the benediction, the one Pope Francis had penned for those the Church too often overlooked. There would be no grand announcement, no public defiance. That was not the way. Instead, Elias had asked a few trusted guards, a secretary from the Apostolic Palace, an elderly archivist, and a young kitchen worker, all of whom had, at one time or another, spoken with reverence about Francis, not just as Pope, but as the man who had listened, truly listened when no one else had. They gathered in the Swiss Guards' private barracks courtyard, shielded from public view by high stone walls and the creeping vines of centuries-old ivy. There were no banners, no trumpets, only a single row of candles carefully placed on the low stone ledges surrounding the courtyard. The group was small, barely 20 people, but the weight of what they were about to do made the air feel heavier, almost sacred. Elias stood at the center, feeling the eyes of the gathering upon him. He wasn't accustomed to leading in this way. Command came naturally on the drill grounds or in the rigid structure of ceremonies. But this was different. This was a kind of leadership that called not for authority, but for humility. Without a word, he drew out the folded benediction and held it carefully between his hands. For a moment, he said nothing. The only sound was the gentle flicker of the candle flames in the evening breeze. Then, in a voice low but firm, Elias began to read, "To those the world does not see, the lonely, the broken, the forgotten." As the words filled the courtyard, something shifted. The rigid postures of the guards softened. Heads bowed. The kitchen boy wiped at his eyes with the sleeve of his apron. An elderly sister from the palace pressed her rosary tighter against her chest, her lips moving in silent prayer. "Know this. You are beloved beyond measure." The words did not echo like grand proclamations. They wrapped around the gathering like a cloak, gentle, encompassing, deeply human. When Elias finished, he closed the paper quietly and stood in the heavy silence that followed. No one clapped. No one cheered. That would have been out of place. Instead, they simply stood together, breathing in the sacredness of a moment untouched by cameras, untouched by protocol. It was Sister Miriam, the frail old nun from the archives, who broke the silence. She stepped forward, her steps shaky but determined, and lit an extra candle from the flame of one of the others. "This," she said softly, her voice cracking with age and emotion, "is the church that Francis loved. This is the church he asked us to be." One by one, the others followed her lead. No grand speeches, no slogans, just candles lit in silent affirmation. Elias watched, his throat tight with emotion. He had not orchestrated this. He had merely opened the door. The spirit moving among them was older, deeper than any command he could have given. When all the candles were lit, the small courtyard glowed like a pocket of sunrise against the encroaching night. In that golden light, faces looked different. No longer guards, servants, or clerks, but simply children of God, equal and beloved. Elias took a slow, steady breath. He had risked everything, his position, his future, for this moment. But as he looked around, he knew, deep in his bones, that it had been worth it. The true church was not marble and gold. It was flesh and spirit. It was the unseen tenderness between strangers. It was the silent benedictions whispered when no one else was listening. The gathering ended quietly, as it had begun. Candles were snuffed out. Heads were bowed. One by one, the small group slipped away into the labyrinth of the Vatican night, leaving no trace but the lingering warmth in the air. Elias remained behind a moment longer, alone in the courtyard. He folded the paper carefully, tucked it inside his jacket once more, and looked up at the stars beginning to pierce the Roman sky. Above him, the bells of St. Peter's Basilica chimed softly, calling the faithful to Vespers, unaware that elsewhere, unseen and undocumented, a different kind of faith had just been reborn. 3 days after the silent gathering, the Vatican returned to its carefully managed rhythm, but beneath the polished surface, ripples had begun to spread. It started innocently enough. A whispered conversation between two junior clerics who had stumbled upon the fading scent of candle wax in the Swiss Guard courtyard. A secretary mentioned seeing a strange glow through an upper window that night. A cleaning woman found a single candle stub tucked behind a stone bench, still faintly warm. In a place as steeped in tradition as the Vatican, where even the positioning of a chair could hold symbolic weight, nothing unusual went unnoticed for. Hung by the end of the week, whispers had reached the ears of Archbishop Matteo Ricci, one of the senior members of the College of Cardinals, and a man known for his hawk-like attention to anything that hinted at unsanctioned activity. He summoned Captain Elias Hartmann to his private office, a high-ceilinged room lined with portraits of past pontiffs, their painted eyes seeming to peer down in silent judgment. "You organized a gathering," Archbishop Ricci said without preamble, his fingers steepled before him on the massive oak desk. Elias stood at rigid attention, hands clasped behind his back. "I did, Your Eminence." No approval sought. No protocol followed. Ricci's voice was flat, clinical. "And the purpose?" Elias hesitated only a moment. "To honor a private benediction written by the late Holy Father, a message we believed should not be forgotten." Ricci leaned back, studying him. "And who authorized you to make that decision?" "No one, Your Eminence," Elias answered steadily. "It was a matter of conscience." The Archbishop's mouth tightened into a thin line. In the Vatican, matters of conscience were messy, unpredictable, and difficult to control, precisely the kind of thing the church hierarchy preferred to avoid. "You understand?" Ricci said, voice low. "That you have placed your career in jeopardy?" "I understand." A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft ticking of an ancient clock on the wall. Finally, Ricci rose and turned to the window overlooking St. Peter's Square. For a moment, he seemed almost reflective. "Tell me, Captain," he said without turning around, "what do you believe the Church is built upon?" Elias chose his words carefully. "Upon faith, Your Eminence. Upon compassion. Upon truth." Ricci's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly. "Not obedience?" he asked. Elias drew a slow, steady breath. "Obedience serves faith. It must never replace it." Another silence, deeper this time. At last the Archbishop turned back, his expression unreadable. "Return to your duties," he said. "You will hear no more of this. For now." Elias saluted crisply, turned, and exited the office, the weight of uncertainty pressing heavily against his back. But that was not the end. Later that evening, in a dimly lit reception hall deep within the Apostolic Palace, the newly elected Pope Clement XIV, once Cardinal Antonio de Luca, addressed a small select gathering of senior clergy and Vatican officials. He was a man known for his sharp mind and quiet heart, a longtime confidant of Pope Francis. "My predecessor," Clement began, his voice clear but gentle, "left behind many gifts, some visible, some hidden." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "There are those among us," he continued, "who have understood that sometimes the spirit of the Church must whisper where the institution roars." The older cardinals shifted uncomfortably. Some exchanged glances. Ricci remained still, expression neutral. "And so," Pope Clement said, lifting a small sheet of vellum, recognizable to those who knew, "we will honor one such gift." He read the benediction aloud. "To those the world does not see, the lonely, the broken, the forgotten." Gasps rose from a few gathered officials. Others bowed their heads, recognizing the words that had until now been confined to secrecy. "This benediction," the Pope said firmly, "will be incorporated into my first public Mass, not as a spectacle but as a reminder, to ourselves most of all, what it is we are truly called to protect." Elias, standing quietly at the back of the hall, felt something inside him loosen, a tension he hadn't even fully realized he carried. His actions had not gone unnoticed, but instead of condemnation, there was acknowledgement. Not loud, not public, but real. As the gathering broke apart and the guests began to disperse, a few priests and guards approached Elias quietly, offering brief nods or murmured blessings. No one spoke openly. No grand announcements were made. But the message was clear. You were right to move. That night, in his small quarters tucked beneath the barracks, Elias lit a single candle beside the folded copy of the benediction he still kept carefully tucked away. He had broken no laws. He had made no public statements. He had simply chosen the higher calling within the silence of his oath. And sometimes, he realized, that was the loudest declaration of faith one could ever make. Life at the Vatican resumed its outward serenity in the weeks that followed. To an outsider, nothing had changed. The Swiss guards still stood immovable at their posts. The bells still tolled their ancient calls to prayer. The great dome of St. Peter's still glistened in the Roman sun. But for Captain Elias Hartmann, everything had changed. The benediction that once existed only as a hidden letter was now a living part of the Church's heart. Pope Clement XIV had woven it into his first Mass, quietly but unmistakably, a tribute to the unseen and the forgotten, the very people for whom Pope Francis had written his final words. No one officially mentioned Elias's role in bringing it to light. There were no commendations, no medals pinned discreetly to his uniform. Recognition in the Vatican rarely came in obvious ways. Instead, it showed itself in smaller, more powerful moments. A silent nod from a cardinal as he passed in the halls. A kitchen worker crossing herself and smiling quietly when Elias entered the courtyard. A handwritten note left anonymously in his quarters that simply read, "For those who dared to love more than they feared." Yet with this quiet acknowledgement came a new reality. Elias could no longer be just a soldier of ceremony. The old ways, the rigid adherence to protocol without questioning, the pride in being unseen, unthinking, no longer fit the man he had become, and the Vatican, in its subtle way, understood this too. Shortly after the public Mass, Elias received an official transfer notice, not as punishment but as recognition. He was reassigned to the office of the Papal Almoner, a small but vital department responsible for administering charity on behalf of the Pope. It was work less visible than guarding golden thrones and grand corridors, but infinitely closer to the heart of the Church's true mission. His new uniform was simpler, a deep blue coat without the ceremonial stripes of the Swiss Guard, adorned only with a small silver cross above the breast, and his new duties were humble. Carrying food baskets to the poor, delivering medicine to forgotten convents, escorting refugee families through the labyrinthine legal processes that would allow them sanctuary within Vatican walls. He no longer marched in perfect formation across marble courtyards. He walked narrow streets, bent low by the needs of others, and, yet for the first time in his life, Elias felt truly upright. One rainy afternoon, as he delivered parcels to a shelter on the outskirts of Rome, he found himself speaking with a young mother who clutched a thin, coughing child to her chest. She did not recognize him as a former Swiss guard. To her, he was simply a man who had come in the name of the Church to offer help. "Why do you do this?" she asked through tear-reddened eyes, accepting a package of bread, milk, and antibiotics. Elias paused, feeling the weight of the question. Not long ago he would have answered, "Because it is my duty." But now his answer came from somewhere deeper. "Because once," he said softly, "someone reminded me that we serve not the walls of the Church, but the people it was built to protect." The woman nodded, tears slipping silently down her cheeks, and Elias realized this too was a kind of guarding, not of ancient relics or priceless art, but of human souls, of dignity, of hope. That evening, as he crossed the Tiber River back toward the Vatican, the rain lightened to a gentle mist, and the last colors of sunset bled into the sky. He passed by St. Peter's Square, now almost empty, the great dome glowing softly above the cobblestones. He paused, looking up. He was no longer part of the parade of uniforms tourists photographed, no longer the faceless sentry behind the halberd. He was something smaller and something greater, a keeper of a different kind of tradition, one written not in laws, but in love, not in marble, but in mercy, not in unbroken stillness, but in courageous movement when it mattered most. Captain Elias Hartmann straightened his coat, tucked his chin against the cool night air, and continued walking, not back into the halls of ceremony, but into the quiet streets where the church's truest battles were fought not for power, but for people. He had not abandoned his oath. He had finally understood it. And somewhere deep in the silent corridors of the Vatican, perhaps in a small, forgotten courtyard where candles had once burned quietly against the night, the spirit of Pope Francis smiled.